In 1857, the household of Judge Theodore Whitmore in Lexington County, South Carolina, appeared to embody the ideal of Southern gentility. The sprawling plantation house, with its towering white columns and meticulously maintained gardens, stood as a testament to the prosperity that cotton had brought to the region. Behind the facade of gracious living, however, lay secrets that would eventually unravel in the most unexpected manner. The Whitmore estate employed 43 enslaved individuals, each assigned specific duties that kept the plantation functioning with clockwork precision. Among them was a young woman named Sarah Elizabeth, whose intelligence and composure had caught the attention of the household staff from her earliest days. Born in 1839 on a neighboring plantation, she had been purchased by Judge Whitmore when she was merely 16 years old, ostensibly to serve as a seamstress and assist with household management. Sarah Elizabeth possessed an unusual gift for observation and memory that set her apart from others in similar circumstances. She could recall conversations word for word, notice the smallest changes in routine, and anticipate the needs of those around her with uncanny accuracy. This ability had initially been viewed as an asset by the Whitmore family, but it would ultimately prove to be something far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. The judge himself was a man of considerable influence in the community, having served on the state Supreme Court for nearly a decade. His reputation for fairness and judicial wisdom was well established among his peers, though those who knew him intimately understood that Theodore Whitmore was a man who valued control above all else. His wife, Margaret, had died 3 years prior to these events, leaving him to manage both his legal affairs and the complexities of plantation life alone. The household maintained a rigid schedule that rarely varied. Morning prayers were conducted at precisely 6 o'clock, followed by breakfast at 7. The judge would then retreat to his study to review legal documents and correspondence until noon, when he would inspect the grounds and oversee the day's agricultural activities. Evenings were spent in his library, where he would read until retiring at exactly 10 o'clock. Sarah Elizabeth had been assigned to maintain the judge's private quarters, including his study and bedroom. This position required her to be present in these spaces for several hours each day, often while the judge was conducting business or entertaining visitors. Over the months, she had developed the ability to move through these rooms with such quiet efficiency that she often went unnoticed, becoming almost invisible to those who occupied these spaces. It was during one of these routine cleaning sessions that Sarah Elizabeth first witnessed something that would change the trajectory of her life forever. The date was October 15th, 1857, and she was dusting the bookshelves in the judge's study when she observed him engaged in a heated discussion with a man she had never seen before. The visitor was well-dressed but appeared agitated, speaking in hushed but urgent tones about matters that seemed to distress both men considerably. Sarah Elizabeth, while continuing her work, found herself able to hear fragments of their conversation. Words like evidence and consequences were repeated several times, along with references to events that had occurred 2 summers past. What struck Sarah Elizabeth most profoundly was not the content of the conversation itself, but rather the judge's demeanor during this exchange. The man she had observed for months as composed and authoritative appeared genuinely frightened. His hands trembled slightly as he poured brandy, and his voice, normally commanding, carried an undertone of desperation that she had never heard before. The mysterious visitor departed after approximately 1 hour, leaving behind an envelope that the judge immediately placed in a locked drawer of his desk. For the remainder of that day, Theodore Whitmore's behavior remained markedly different from his usual patterns. He missed his customary afternoon inspection of the grounds, failed to appear for the evening meal, and could be heard pacing in his study well past his normal bedtime. Sarah Elizabeth's natural curiosity, combined with her exceptional memory for detail, led her to pay closer attention to the judge's activities in the days following this encounter. She began to notice subtle changes in his routine that others seemed to overlook entirely. He would often pause while reading letters, sometimes rereading the same passage multiple times before carefully folding the documents and placing them in the locked drawer. More significantly, she observed that the judge had begun to make frequent visits to a section of the property that had previously remained unused. This area, located approximately half a mile from the main house, contained an old tobacco barn that had been abandoned years earlier, when the plantation had shifted exclusively to cotton production. The structure was partially hidden by overgrown vegetation and had been considered unsafe for normal use. The judge's visits to this location always occurred during the late afternoon hours, typically lasting between 30 and 45 minutes. He would travel there alone, carrying a small leather satchel, and would return to the main house, appearing physically exhausted despite the relatively short distance involved. On several occasions, Sarah Elizabeth noticed that his clothing bore traces of fresh dirt, as though he had been engaged in some form of manual labor. These observations might have remained nothing more than curious anomalies had it not been for an incident that occurred on November 3rd of that same year. While cleaning the judge's bedroom, Sarah Elizabeth discovered a torn piece of paper that had fallen behind his writing desk. The fragment contained what appeared to be part of a list written in the judge's distinctive handwriting. Though most of the text was illegible due to water damage, the only clearly readable portion contained the words "Remind," followed by what appeared to be coordinates or measurements: 30 paces east, 7 feet down. Below this was a single word that made Sarah Elizabeth's blood run cold: Clara. Clara had been a house servant who had worked at the plantation until the previous summer. According to the official account provided to the other enslaved individuals, she had been sold to a family in Charleston and had departed the property in July of 1856. Her sudden disappearance had been unusual, as no advance notice had been given, and she had left behind personal possessions that would normally have been taken during such a transfer. The discovery of this paper fragment prompted Sarah Elizabeth to recall other details about Clara's disappearance that had seemed insignificant at the time. She remembered that Clara had appeared increasingly distressed in the weeks preceding her alleged departure, often seeming lost in thought and displaying an uncharacteristic nervousness around the judge. On one occasion, Sarah Elizabeth had observed Clara leaving the judge's study with tears in her eyes, though Clara had refused to discuss what had transpired during that meeting. Armed with this new information, Sarah Elizabeth began to piece together a narrative that was far more sinister than anything she had previously imagined. The timing of Clara's disappearance coincided with the period referenced by the mysterious visitor as 2 summers past. The judge's recent visits to the abandoned tobacco barn, combined with the cryptic measurements found on the paper fragment, suggested activities that went far beyond normal plantation management. The weight of these realizations created a profound dilemma for Sarah Elizabeth. As an enslaved person, she possessed no legal standing to make accusations against a white man, particularly one of Judge Whitmore's social position. Any attempt to report her suspicions to authorities would likely result in severe punishment for herself, assuming anyone would even listen to her claims. Yet the possibility that Clara's fate had been far different from the official explanation tormented her conscience. It was during this period of internal struggle that Sarah Elizabeth conceived of a plan that was as audacious as it was dangerous. Rather than attempting to expose the judge's actions through conventional means, she would use her position within the household and her exceptional memory to gather irrefutable evidence of his guilt. More importantly, She would find a way to compel him to confess his crimes through his own words. The foundation of her strategy lay in exploiting the judge's belief that enslaved individuals were incapable of sophisticated reasoning or planning. Sarah Elizabeth had observed that white members of the household often spoke freely in her presence, seemingly forgetting that she was capable of understanding and remembering their words. This assumption of intellectual inferiority would become the cornerstone of her elaborate deception. Over the following weeks, Sarah Elizabeth began to implement her plan with painstaking care. She started by making subtle changes to the judge's daily environment, minor alterations that would be almost imperceptible to casual observation, but would create a growing sense of unease in someone harboring guilty secrets. Books would be moved slightly on their shelves, papers would be reordered in stacks, and personal items would be repositioned in ways that suggested someone had been examining them closely. These small disruptions were designed to awaken the judge's paranoia gradually, creating the impression that someone was investigating his activities without revealing the source of the surveillance. Sarah Elizabeth understood that a guilty mind would interpret these signs as evidence of impending discovery, potentially prompting careless behavior that would provide her with additional information. Simultaneously, she began to demonstrate an apparent fascination with seemingly innocent topics that were actually connected to her investigation. She would hum spiritual songs that contained references to justice and revelation, particularly when cleaning areas near the judge's study. She would occasionally mutter fragments of biblical verses about hidden sins being brought to light, always ensuring that her voice was just loud enough to be overheard. The psychological pressure created by these tactics began to manifest in the judge's behavior within a matter of days. He became increasingly irritable and prone to sudden outbursts over minor household matters. His sleep patterns became erratic, and household staff reported hearing him moving about the main house during the early morning hours when he would normally have been resting. Most significantly, the judge's visits to the abandoned tobacco barn became more frequent and agitated. Sarah Elizabeth, who had been carefully observing these expeditions from a concealed position, noted that he now appeared to be inspecting the area around the structure rather than entering it directly. On 2 occasions, she witnessed him digging small holes in various locations, apparently checking to ensure that the ground had not been disturbed by others. The crucial breakthrough in Sarah Elizabeth's investigation came on November 28th, when she overheard the judge engaged in what appeared to be a conversation with himself while alone in his study. The stress of the preceding weeks had clearly taken a severe toll on his mental state, and he had begun to vocalize his anxieties without realizing that he was being observed. Standing outside the partially open door to his study, Sarah Elizabeth listened as Judge Whitmore rehearsed explanations for events that had never been officially acknowledged. He spoke aloud about protecting the family honor and preventing scandal, while repeatedly returning to concerns about what Clara might have told others before her death. This inadvertent confession provided Sarah Elizabeth with the confirmation she had sought, but it also presented her with an even greater challenge. She now possessed knowledge of a crime that demanded justice, but she still lacked the means to ensure that justice would be served. The judge's words, overheard by a single enslaved witness, would carry no weight in any legal proceeding. It was at this critical juncture that Sarah Elizabeth's plan entered its most audacious phase. Rather than attempting to expose the judge's guilt through external authorities, she would manipulate him into confessing his crimes publicly, in the presence of witnesses who could not be dismissed or silenced. The method she chose to accomplish this goal would later be described by those who witnessed it as either brilliant or diabolical, depending on their perspective. Sarah Elizabeth had observed that Judge Whitmore's guilt and paranoia had made him increasingly susceptible to suggestion and prone to erratic behavior. She calculated that with the proper stimulus, she could provoke him into a confession that would be impossible to retract or explain away. The stimulus she chose was deceptively simple. She would convince him that Clara had returned from the dead to expose his crimes. The execution of this deception required careful timing and theatrical skill that drew upon traditions of spiritual expression within the enslaved community. Sarah Elizabeth began by spreading subtle rumors among the household staff about unusual occurrences that suggested supernatural activity. She reported hearing unexplained sounds near the tobacco barn, finding objects moved from their usual positions, and sensing the presence of someone who was no longer among the living. These reports, delivered with apparent reluctance and fear, quickly circulated throughout the plantation community. The other enslaved individuals, already nervous about Clara's unexplained disappearance, found these accounts deeply troubling. More importantly, news of these supposed supernatural manifestations eventually reached Judge Whitmore through the household staff who served his meals and maintained his living quarters. The judge's reaction to these reports exceeded even Sarah Elizabeth's expectations. Rather than dismissing them as superstitious nonsense, he appeared to accept them as confirmation of his worst fears. His behavior became increasingly erratic, and he began to spend hours staring out of his study window in the direction of the tobacco barn, as though expecting to see something emerge from that area. Sarah Elizabeth recognized that the judge was now psychologically prepared for the final phase of her plan, but she understood that its success would depend upon precise timing and flawless execution. She chose December 15th, 1857, as the date for her ultimate deception, knowing that the judge would be entertaining several prominent visitors from Charleston who had come to discuss legal matters related to upcoming legislation. The presence of these respected witnesses was crucial to Sarah Elizabeth's strategy, as their testimony would carry significant weight in any subsequent investigation. She had carefully observed their scheduled arrival and had determined that they would be dining with the judge on the evening of the 15th, providing her with the opportunity she required. As the appointed evening approached, Sarah Elizabeth made her final preparations with meticulous care. She had obtained a white dress similar to one that Clara had often worn, and she had studied Clara's mannerisms and speech patterns with the dedication of a professional actress. More importantly, she had identified the optimal location and timing for her appearance to achieve maximum psychological impact on the judge while ensuring that the visiting dignitaries would witness his reaction. The dinner party proceeded according to the established schedule, with Judge Whitmore and his 3 guests discussing political developments and legal precedents over an elaborate meal. The conversation was cordial but serious, focusing on matters of regional importance that required careful consideration and planning. None of the participants suspected that they were about to become witnesses to one of the most extraordinary confessions in the history of American jurisprudence. At precisely 9:30 in the evening, as the group had moved from the dining room to the judge's study for brandy and cigars, Sarah Elizabeth initiated the final phase of her elaborate deception. She had positioned herself outside the study window, partially concealed by the shadows cast by the moonlight filtering through the oak trees that surrounded the main house. Using skills developed through years of careful observation and mimicry, Sarah Elizabeth began to recreate Clara's voice and mannerisms with startling accuracy. She called out the judge's name in a tone that was both mournful and accusatory, demanding to know why he had sent her to the cold ground when she had kept his secrets faithfully. The psychological impact of this apparition on Judge Whitmore was immediate and devastating. The man who had maintained rigid self-control for months suddenly collapsed into a state of complete emotional breakdown. In the presence of his distinguished guests, he began to confess to actions that had been hidden from the world for more than a year. Through tears and frantic gestures, Judge Whitmore admitted that Clara had not been sold to a family in Charleston, as he had claimed. Instead, she had threatened to expose certain improprieties that had occurred between them, prompting him to take actions that he now characterized as having been driven by desperation and fear of social ruin. The judge's confession, delivered in the presence of 3 witnesses of unquestioned reputation, included specific details about the location of Clara's remains and the circumstances that had led to her death. He described how he had struck her during a heated argument, causing her to fall and suffer fatal injuries, and how he had subsequently buried her body near the tobacco barn to conceal evidence of the incident. The visiting dignitaries, shocked by these revelations, immediately took action to ensure that proper authorities were notified and that appropriate legal proceedings were initiated. Within hours, a formal investigation was underway, and by the following morning, Clara's remains had been discovered exactly where Judge Whitmore had indicated they would be found. Sarah Elizabeth's role in orchestrating this confession was never officially acknowledged, as she maintained the pretense that she had been as surprised by the evening's events as everyone else present. Her apparent simple-mindedness, which had been crucial to the success of her plan, continued to serve as protection against suspicion that she had been involved in manipulating the judge's breakdown. The legal proceedings that followed Judge Whitmore's confession moved with remarkable speed by the standards of the era. His admission of guilt in front of multiple witnesses, combined with the physical evidence discovered at the burial site, made a lengthy trial unnecessary. Within 6 weeks, he had been formally charged, convicted, and sentenced to death for the murder of Clara. The case attracted considerable attention throughout the region, not only because of the prominence of the individuals involved, but also because of the unusual circumstances surrounding the confession. Newspaper accounts of the trial focused heavily on the apparent supernatural elements of the story, with many writers expressing amazement at the divine justice that had compelled the judge to reveal his crimes. Sarah Elizabeth found herself in an unexpectedly improved position following these events. The new owner of the plantation, Judge Whitmore's nephew from Virginia, proved to be a more humane master who implemented several reforms in the treatment of enslaved individuals. Moreover, Sarah Elizabeth's apparent gift for supernatural communication had earned her a measure of respect and even fear among both white and black members of the community. Years later, as the institution of slavery crumbled throughout the South, Sarah Elizabeth would occasionally share the true story of her deception with trusted friends and family members. She explained how her careful observation of human nature, combined with her understanding of guilt and fear, had enabled her to achieve justice for Clara through means that no court of law would have recognized as legitimate. The abandoned tobacco barn, which had served as Clara's grave for more than a year, was eventually torn down and replaced with a small chapel. Local residents, unaware of Sarah Elizabeth's role in the events, credited the building's construction to divine intervention and the power of restless spirits to demand justice from beyond the grave. Judge Whitmore was executed on February 14, 1858, maintaining his confession until the end while expressing remorse for his actions. His final words, according to witnesses present at the execution, included a plea for forgiveness from Clara's spirit and an acknowledgement that his punishment was both just and inevitable. The legal documents related to the case were sealed by order of the state Supreme Court, ostensibly to protect the privacy of the families involved, but more likely to prevent further investigation into the supernatural elements that had led to the confession. These records remained classified until 1968, when they were discovered during a routine archival review and subsequently transferred to microfilm storage. Sarah Elizabeth lived until 1893, dying peacefully at the age of 54 in a small house she had purchased with money earned through domestic work after emancipation. She never married, though she maintained close relationships with several families in the community who regarded her as a source of wisdom and guidance during difficult times. Her obituary in the local newspaper made no mention of the events of 1857, referring to her simply as a devoted member of the community whose quiet strength and dignity served as an inspiration to all who knew her. The true nature of her extraordinary intelligence and courage remained hidden, just as she had intended when she first conceived her plan for justice. In the decades that followed, historians and legal scholars would occasionally reference the Whitmore case as an example of how guilt and psychological pressure could compel even the most controlled individuals to confess their crimes. None of these academic discussions ever considered the possibility that the confession had been anything other than a spontaneous breakdown triggered by supernatural intervention. The story of Sarah Elizabeth's deception has been preserved primarily through oral tradition within certain African American families in South Carolina, passed down through generations as an example of how intelligence and determination could overcome even the most overwhelming disadvantages. These accounts, while varying in specific details, consistently emphasize her careful planning and psychological manipulation of the judge's guilt. Modern researchers who have studied the available documentation suggest that Sarah Elizabeth's success in orchestrating Judge Whitmore's confession represents one of the most sophisticated examples of psychological manipulation recorded in antebellum America. Her ability to exploit the judge's guilty conscience while maintaining her own safety demonstrates a level of strategic thinking that challenges contemporary assumptions about the intellectual capabilities of enslaved individuals. The physical evidence supporting this interpretation remains limited, as most of the original documents were either destroyed during the Civil War or deliberately removed from public archives to prevent embarrassment to prominent families. However, a handwritten note discovered in 1962 among the personal effects of Judge Whitmore's nephew provides tantalizing confirmation of Sarah Elizabeth's true role in these events. The note, apparently written several years after the execution, contains the nephew's private observations about the remarkable intelligence of the woman Sarah, who possessed an understanding of human nature that exceeded that of many educated men. He specifically mentions his suspicion that she had orchestrated events with a precision that suggested careful planning rather than supernatural intervention. This document, now housed in a private collection and unavailable for public examination, represents the only known contemporary acknowledgement of Sarah Elizabeth's deception by a white witness to the events. The nephew's decision to commit these thoughts to paper while keeping them private suggests that he recognized the extraordinary nature of what he had observed, but understood the social impossibility of publicly crediting an enslaved woman with such sophisticated planning. The broader implications of Sarah Elizabeth's success extend beyond the specific case of Judge Whitmore's confession. Her story provides insight into the hidden intellectual resistance that existed within the enslaved community, demonstrating how individuals denied formal education could develop complex strategies for survival and justice within an oppressive system. The method she employed, exploiting white assumptions about black intellectual inferiority while simultaneously demonstrating superior psychological understanding, represents a form of resistance that historians are only beginning to fully appreciate. Her ability to remain invisible while manipulating events from within the system shows how the appearance of compliance could mask sophisticated forms of rebellion. Contemporary accounts from other plantations in the region suggest that Sarah Elizabeth's story may not have been entirely unique. References to enslaved individuals who possessed unusual insight into the minds of their masters appear in several private letters and diary entries from the 1850s and 60s, though none describe deceptions as elaborate as the one she orchestrated. The long-term impact of the Whitmore case on the local community extended well beyond the immediate legal consequences. The revelation that a respected judge had committed murder created a crisis of confidence in the local legal system that persisted for years. Several other cases that Whitmore had decided were quietly reviewed, though no evidence of additional improprieties was discovered. More significantly, the case contributed to growing tensions about the reliability of enslaved testimony and the possibility that white masters were not as secure in their authority as they believed. While Sarah Elizabeth's role remained officially unacknowledged, rumors about her involvement circulated among both white and black residents, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty about what enslaved individuals actually knew and understood. The psychological aspects of Sarah Elizabeth's deception continue to fascinate modern researchers studying the intersection of trauma, guilt, and confession. Her intuitive understanding of how guilt manifests in behavior and her ability to amplify that guilt through environmental manipulation suggests a sophisticated grasp of psychological principles that would not be formally articulated by professional psychologists for several more decades. The final chapter of this remarkable story unfolded in 1891, 2 years before Sarah Elizabeth's death, when she was visited by a young journalist investigating historical accounts of supernatural phenomena in the South. During their conversation, conducted in the privacy of her modest home, she provided him with a detailed account of her deception, explaining her motivations and methods with remarkable clarity. The journalist, initially skeptical of her claims, became convinced of their authenticity when Sarah Elizabeth demonstrated her ability to recreate Clara's voice and mannerisms with startling accuracy. She explained that she had continued to practice these skills throughout her life, both as a way of honoring Clara's memory and as a reminder of her own capacity for strategic thinking and planning. This interview, preserved in the journalist's private papers, provides the most detailed first-hand account of Sarah Elizabeth's psychological manipulation of Judge Whitmore. She described her careful observation of his guilt responses, her systematic campaign to increase his paranoia, and her calculation of the optimal timing and setting for the final confrontation. Perhaps most remarkably, she expressed no regret about her deception, viewing it as a necessary act of justice within a system that provided no legal recourse for the wrongs committed against Clara and countless others. Her matter-of-fact description of events reveals a woman who understood exactly what she had accomplished and took quiet pride in her success. The journalist never published this interview, apparently recognizing that the social climate of the 1890s was not ready for such revelations about the intellectual capabilities and strategic thinking of formerly enslaved individuals. The manuscript remained in his family's possession until 1964, when it was donated to a university archive with the stipulation that it remain sealed until the year 2000. Today, Sarah Elizabeth's story serves as a powerful reminder of the hidden histories that exist within the documented record of American slavery. Her extraordinary intelligence, courage, and strategic thinking challenge simplistic narratives about the antebellum period, while honoring the memory of all those who found ways to resist oppression and seek justice within an unjust system. The old plantation where these events unfolded has long since been abandoned, with only the foundation stones of the main house remaining visible among the encroaching forest. The site where the tobacco barn once stood is now marked by a small depression in the earth, barely noticeable to casual observers, but still detectable by those who know where to look. Local residents occasionally report strange sounds emanating from this area during the winter months, though these accounts are generally attributed to wind patterns and the settling of old root systems rather than supernatural activity. Whether Sarah Elizabeth would approve of such prosaic explanations remains a matter of speculation. The legacy of her remarkable deception lives on in the oral traditions of families who trace their ancestry to the enslaved community of that plantation, preserved as an example of how intelligence, patience, and careful planning could triumph over seemingly impossible odds. In their telling, Sarah Elizabeth becomes not just a clever woman who sought justice for a friend, but a symbol of the hidden strength and wisdom that sustained their ancestors through the darkest chapters of American history. Her story reminds us that behind every official record and documented event, there may exist untold narratives of courage, intelligence, and resistance that challenge our understanding of the past and illuminate possibilities for the future. In the case of Sarah Elizabeth, a woman who appeared to her contemporaries as nothing more than a simple house servant, proved to be one of the most sophisticated psychological strategists of her era. The sound that still echoes from that forgotten corner of South Carolina is not the supernatural voice of a murdered woman seeking justice from beyond the grave, but rather the whispered memory of a brilliant mind that refused to accept injustice and found a way to ensure that truth would ultimately prevail. And perhaps in the end, that is the most remarkable form of haunting of all.